reproduction. When we talk about reproduction, though, of course, because it's biology, we're going to talk about all living things. Two main forms of reproduction, sexual and asexual. So it starts off with this diagram, but it also mentions that most animals, because all we're studying is animal reproduction, most animals reproduce sexually. Before we even get into the comparison, let's discuss, dialogue, the difference between sexual and asexual reproduction. And disadvantages and advantages to each. So start with sexual. What's unique about sexual reproduction? Their genetic variation. That's the number one thing that is good about sexual reproduction. So advantage or disadvantage? Advantage, okay? Something else about sexual reproduction. Genetic variation isn't the only characteristic of sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction. Okay, we have male and female. Is that an advantage and disadvantage? Or just, why is that a disadvantage? Yeah, you have to find a mate. And with that being said, still, how could that perhaps present a problem? You can't find one? What if, for example, there was like a big disaster and the population was cut down to just a few people, and you had maybe one male and three females, or one female and two males? Like the competition would increase in here. Competition increases, and so what happens to our genetic variation then if that's the case? It goes down because we're only left with just a few people. What about your environment? How does sexual reproduction, how could it be seen as an advantage / disadvantage to your environment? Sexual reproduction. Oh wait, I'm not going to. Y'all are smart enough to know. Sexual reproduction in the environment. Okay, say that one more time.
It's not suitable for reproduction.
Okay, the conditions are unfavorable. So how would sexual reproduction play into that? If conditions were unfavorable. Okay. Only the fittest would survive, so what would we start to see in our population? Mutations. And that would be a benefit of sexual reproduction. So the environment changes, conditions become unfavorable, sexual reproduction is beneficial. What if it were the opposite? If the environment wasn't changing? What would sexual reproduction be introducing? Okay. Offspring that are more adaptive. But if the environment's not changing, is there a benefit to genetic variation?
Yes.
What if it does, but if the environment's not changing? Okay. All right. So, like just say, environmental conditions have stayed pretty stagnant, pretty stable for 70 or 80 years. We continue to sexually reproduce. We're introducing genetic variation. Is that genetic variation necessarily needed? Now, is that, in actuality, is it likely that an individual that sexually reproduces is going to be in an environment that doesn't change? No, not usually. Okay, so let's roll to asexual reproduction. How's asexual reproduction different? Okay, it's one parent, so benefit or disadvantage? Why is it both? They reproduce fast, they die fast. What else? No genetic variation, everybody's the same. Yes, if the environmental conditions are the same, this is great. But if they change, it's not so good. Benefits and drawbacks to both sexual and asexual reproduction. Again, the majority of organisms in the animal kingdom sexually reproduce, which is what we're going to focus on after we discuss the different types of asexual reproduction. So, I wanted to discuss all of that in dialogue because I want to make sure that, because we're going to do general today, then tomorrow we're going to go straight into just animals, humans. Then we're going to go back to general, all organisms, and then we're going to end with humans. So, sexual reproduction includes sperm and egg, and we call those gametes. Both of those are haploid. What does that mean? Haploid.
Only one of the...
One set of chromosomes. So sperm has one set of chromosomes, egg has one set of chromosomes. When they come together, they form a diploid zygote. A zygote, by definition, is just one cell. So that's just when sperm and egg meet. As soon as that cell divides, it's no longer a zygote. An egg may also be called an ova. I don't know if it says it up there, but I'm sure it does. Okay, an ovum. Producing a zygote. All sexually reproduced offspring are genetically different, and this is the mode of reproduction used by most animals. Asexual, again, single parent, genetic variation decreases, and we talked about the benefits and the drawbacks of that. Asexual first. Asexual reproduction means that you clone. Your offspring is basically a clone of yours. Different ways that this could take place. Budding takes place in sponges. And there's, I don't really care for SpongeBob, but when my kids watch it, sometimes I'm like, okay, that's for legit. One day he was budding. SpongeBob was. And that parallels with the fact that he's supposed to be a sponge. And he was having offspring. All budding is, as an organism, a little baby grows here, and it just drops off. So, it's a clone, because there's no other genetic material introduced. But you just grow a small baby, and it falls off. And of course, if you're a very simple organism, a small baby is nothing more than just a few cells. Regeneration, you and I have discussed this before when we talked about sea stars or starfish. Regeneration is where that organism is fragmented and broken up, and that the fragment itself will regenerate an entire organism. And we talked about that farmer and him and his mussel farm, that he had cut up all those sea stars. Then parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis says you have an unfertilized egg, so no genetic material is introduced, but all of a sudden it reaps a child, or it reaps an offspring. In humans, this is not a thing. Humans don't have parthenogenesis, unless you're talking like in a biblical sense. They're the only way that Mary could have become pregnant without having intercourse, like that type of thing. Okay, I'm not trying to argue the Bible though. Saying that with humans, you're not just not sexually active and then all of a sudden you're pregnant. That's not a thing. Okay, so, yes, sir.
I don't know how much this has to do with that, but you know how like frogs can change sexes?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Gene expression.
Okay, so they just
Certain
kinda
genes are turned on.
swap around. Switch sides?
They switch sides. They just switch sides. They're back to the other gene now, so that's what it is. It's gene expression, and that's only in harsh conditions.
Okay.
And when environmental conditions, like, it's not just, oh, everything's good, all of a sudden I just want to be a boy. It's not like that. That's not a thing. That's not a thing. Parthenogenesis. Again, all of these are forms of asexual reproduction, so you are identical cellularly to the parent that you are being born or being created from. There's no human parthenogenesis there. Chicken eggs that haven't been fertilized, you can put them, they can have babies if the conditions are right, but not on humans. So here's showing you an organism from the phylum Porifera, which would be the sponges, and they just grow tiny little babies, and then they just fall off. Here, you had a fragmented sea star that's beginning to regenerate the whole organism. So, form of asexual reproduction. Okay, sexual reproduction, you have your two gametes, your sperm, your egg. Male and female gametes that are haploid, they come together during fertilization to form a diploid zygote. Most animal species reproduce sexually because it increases genetic variation. It also allows for organisms to become adapted quicker as environments change. The very last bullet says, it may make it easier to eliminate harmful alleles. How does sexual reproduction help us get rid of things that may not be so beneficial? Natural selection. You'll not survive long enough to reproduce. Now, and when we talk about certain organisms, so you don't survive long enough to reproduce, so your alleles don't get carried on, or maybe you choose not to reproduce. But if that's the case, then how come we still have these weak alleles? If they don't survive long enough to reproduce, or they choose not to reproduce, how come those alleles aren't gone? We have sympathy mates. Remember we discussed the fact that there are organisms who feel sorry for emotionally supportive, and so they have their babies, yes? So that keeps it there. There's one other way. And this, it's one of those things where you don't really know it until it's like generations later. You're a carrier for that gene. So someone carries that allele, carries it, and maybe 5 or 6 generations later, it's actually expressed. So, do carriers know they're carriers? Not usually. So that's how these alleles end up staying within these populations. We have sympathy mates, and then if you're a carrier. Okay? So advantages and disadvantages, this is where you and I started today. With asexual reproduction, you can reproduce quickly. Conditions are good. Everybody's happy. Disadvantage if conditions change. Not so good. We talked about there's no genetic variation there. And we find this type of reproduction is very prevalent in stable environments where things don't change. Versus sexual reproduction that does require 2 individuals, which is technically a disadvantage because you have to find a mate, and then a mate suitable with characteristics that you would like your offspring to have. It does allow for an increase in genetic variation, which leads to an increase in natural selection. So we see that certain things are stronger and certain things are selected for, I should say, and selected against. All right, this is where we're stopping today. I just wanted to intro sexual and asexual reproduction, and you'll be on your